We're going to welcome Beth Carter. She is a management consultant, does executive search, HR solutions, also is an entrepreneurship professor at Bryant, and is the executive director of the Rhode Island Business Competition.
This is a favorite topic of mine. I am a corporate trainer. I also teach at Bryant University. As Avi mentioned, I teach leadership and I teach team building and conflict resolution. The thing with negotiating is that we have to realize we bring value to the table. Either if we're looking for a job and we're negotiating a salary, we're negotiating what we're selling a product or service, there's value behind that. And I sometimes think that we kind of get a little lost in thinking about that as value. So, there's a lot of misconceptions about negotiating. Why is it so difficult? Why do we try to avoid it? And as you can see here, I listed a bunch of different things. We're only on this call for half an hour, so I'm going to kind of keep it a little bit short. But think about, who are you negotiating with? Why do you have, maybe you're have a little anxiety or a little bit of fear. The thing with fear is that it can really paralyze you. So, look at fear in a different way. Think of fear as face everything and rise versus forget everything and run. So when you think about negotiations, you've been negotiating for a very long time. You've been negotiating since pretty much before you could even talk. You would cry for a bottle, or you would ask for a cookie or an extra, story at bedtime. So you negotiated your whole life. But the problem is when you got to maybe high school or college or right after that, your confidence might have gone out of the window. So really think about, what is it that is really, how do you feel when you negotiate? And the problem is a lot of people think of negotiations as a conflict, and it really isn't. It's an opportunity, needless to say, to sell a product or service or get a job. But the other thing is that it's an opportunity for growth. So as I mentioned at the beginning, you really do need to calculate your true value. So take a step back and think about, what are you known for? Even if you're selling a product, you as the entrepreneur need to think about what you bring to the table. You can sell a widget, and there's many widgets out there, but why one entrepreneur is more successful than the other is the way they market, the way they talk about their product, the way they bring out their passion, things along those lines. The other thing is what could you do better? I mean, none of us are perfect. We certainly can, broaden our capabilities. So where could you, be a little bit better? So if you're in a situation now where you already have clients or customers, the best thing you can do is go back to them and say, what did you like about my product or service? Is there something I could do better? The problem is we always think of feedback as negative. And the reality is that feedback actually is a gift. So if someone's willing to be really honest with you and tell you what they like and possibly what they don't like, that gives you an opportunity to change things, maybe take a step back, think about things a little bit differently. Or if they really love the product, or service, maybe you can do a second type of product or service or something like that. I've owned 4 companies, 2 I still have and 2 I don't. And, I look back on the ones that didn't make it, and I realized one thing, that I don't work, I like to own the company myself versus having partners. But I also realized that the way we marketed it at times or did business development, we could have done a better job. And that was partly because my partner and I weren't in sync. So really, that's the point of looking at calculating your true value, okay? The other piece of it too is, what are you going to charge? And the thing is that you have to do your homework, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But the other thing is, you got to really dig down deep and figure out what kind of negotiator you are. And again, negotiating is like conflict. Actually, I was talking in my leadership class last night, and we were talking about conflict. And really, these 5 categories fit very well with the way you deal with conflict. So some people don't like to negotiate at all. They'd rather pay the price and move on. So they're avoiding. And with the avoiding, sometimes you need to, for a variety of different reasons. But in general, if you avoid, then you don't know what you potentially could have. So if you're offering, like in my case, I might be talking to a client on the phone, and, I set my price, and they said, fine, I'll pay it. Well, that's great. But could there be opportunities to negotiate higher or do some other types of things? Yes, possibly. The next one is compromise. And this entails each side to coming to some agreement. So hopefully the gains are equal. No matter what you're trying to do, at the end of the negotiation, you want it to be a win-win. You want both sides to be happy, because if it's a customer or a client, you want that person to come back. But more importantly, a really good customer or client is the ones that give you referrals, that they recommend you to others. So you want to continue to build that relationship. The next one is accommodating. And that's when you're trying to be nice. And I have to tell you, after 28 years of owning my own company, when I've accommodated a client, it's not been a good situation. So maybe I cut my fees, or I added something, or something like that. And keep in mind that 80% of your problems come from 20% of your clients. So yes, there's times you may want to accommodate a little bit, but when your gut tells you that this isn't going to be good and you're trying to be nice, it's going to bite you in the butt. The next one is competitive. And there are times, yet maybe you want to negotiate competitively, but the reality is that in the end, it's going to be a win-lose situation. One person is definitely going to be the winner on it, and the other person is going to lose. So again, is it worth it to win? And again, depending on the situation, it may be. But if you're selling a product or service, most likely you don't want to be competitive with the person you're negotiating with. And then the last one is collaborative, which is considered the most creative of all the types of negotiating. And this can be very time consuming. So what this consists of is brainstorming ideas and resolving tough issues to come to an amicable offer. So maybe you have a complex type of service, and you're trying to work it through with a client. Maybe it's $1 million project or something like that. And you're trying to brainstorm how it's going to work. So maybe it's like a consulting project, and maybe there's different layers to it. There's maybe a very extensive timeline, things along those lines. So you're trying to brainstorm, how you're going to work with this client. Maybe they come back to you and you go back and forth and back and forth. If you have the time to do it, it's fine. But if you need a quick decision on something, or the negotiation has to be very quick, that's not going to work for you. So there's obviously various steps in negotiating. And the first one, I can't stress this enough, is prepare. First of all, know who you're negotiating with. If it's a one-on-one situation, go on LinkedIn, Google them, look who they're connected to. I'm not suggesting that, you go on their Facebook or Twitter, but really understand who that person is. If you're selling a product and you're selling it in, a pop-up shop or online or whatever that may be, still try to figure out who that customer is. And, one way to do that, of course, is to look at your competitors or similar types of products. So if you're selling like a new kind of bed linen, of course you would look at those competitors, but you might also want to look at like mattress companies and other people make curtains and towels and other things for the bedroom, maybe, night lights and things along those lines. But the more you're prepared, the better you will be in your negotiations. And that little picture to the right, if you can see it, is a guy looking into the mirror. So part of that is you got to practice. There's certainly go-to words or phrases that we use, and we're good at it. And when we're talking about our product or service, or we're negotiating a salary, but we might get caught off guard. Someone may say something to us and we don't know how to respond, or we clam up, or we get nervous, or anxiety kicks in, or someone becomes maybe a little competitive with you and you weren't expecting that. So try to figure out all kinds of different scenarios that could happen and practice. You can either practice with someone else or practice in the mirror, video yourself, whatever it may be. But the idea is that you can really try to figure out some of the things and phrases that you could use. The other piece to this is, what are your triggers? And what I mean by that is we all have triggers that set us off. As an example for myself, if I hear people whining, I just shut down. I just cannot deal with whining. So if someone starts whining about, oh, the cost of your services are too high, or, oh, I thought I could just get this, or blah, 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 I kind of shut down. Because I know that's a trigger of mine, I have to figure out ways to work through it. And I have, but it's taken a while. So I really suggest if you have certain triggers that bother you, maybe someone's condescending, or maybe it's nothing even really super negative, but it just grates on you, you need to work through that. The next piece is start, if you've never really negotiated in a while, or you're very uncomfortable negotiating, I suggest you negotiate low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is not negotiating with your product or service or salary, but go out and negotiate something. Walk into like maybe a small shop where you can negotiate with the shop owner. I always tell people to go to Manhattan. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up right outside of Manhattan. So I suggest to people to go bargain and negotiate with the vendors on the streets, because there's no risk involved. Yeah, maybe you want that scarf, but you know what? They're not willing to bargain with you. You walk away. But at least it's good practice. And I love doing it. I think it's a lot of fun. And that's the other piece of it. You've got to maybe put a fun element into it. So try negotiating on very low risk items and then build your tolerance up. The next piece is determining your BATNA. And I'm sure most of you don't know what a BATNA is, but it's a phrase that was coined back in 1981. And what it stands for is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So the point is you're going to select all plausible alternatives you might pursue if you can't reach a deal with your the current client or customer. So you need to figure out what's the best alternative. So if I'm offering 4 different services at X price and they push back and they say, no, I'm not, you know, maybe you will go to doing 3 services. Or if you're selling, you know, 3 pots and they push back and, you know, they're willing to pay $1,000 for 4 pots, but not 3 pots, maybe you would throw that in. But the idea is that you have to estimate the value associated with each alternative. So you have to figure out what is your absolute bottom price. So think about car shopping. If you go in and you know, your game plan is to spend $30,000 on a car, and you know, they start nickel and diming you or this or that, you know, and you say, I can't spend more than $30,000. And they say, okay, well, it's really $32,000. You have to figure out, are you going to walk away from it, or are you going to say, all right, I'll pay $32,000, but I want like a free year of oil changes, and I want special mats, and I want this, this, and this. So really figure out what your best alternative is. And if you don't do that ahead of time, I can guarantee that you're going to run into a problem later, because they are going to push back potentially. And if you haven't figured out like how much money you absolutely have to make, or is it really worth it, then you need to step away. So if you're in a service business, this is critical, more so than even a product. And the reason why I say that is if you are charging, let's say, $1,000 for your certain certain services, and the person pushes back, and the next thing you know, you're going to let them get away with 500. The problem is that time, let's say it was 5 hours, that 5 hours, you could have been doing something else. Meaning you could have been working with a $1,000 client. So you have to figure out the pros and cons. You know, is it worth taking this customer on because I know they have a great network and they've already told me they'll refer me to 5 of their friends and family members or whomever, colleagues. Then it might be worth it. But there's been times where I've taken on projects and I realized that for the amount of money I'm being paid, it's not worth it to me. And I would have rather have either worked with another client, of course, paying more, or step away from it. So you have to kind of figure that out. If you're still not good at negotiating, I strongly suggest you get a coach. I am a coach, and I think there's a lot of value to coaching. And so I think that if you need to work with someone who's a negotiations coach or a business coach, or a career coach if you're looking for a job, I definitely think it's worth it, because again, it helps with the practicing. Your body language is another piece of this. You know, you could be saying the right words, but if your body language is different or your inflection in your voice, it could be a real problem. So it's worth every penny sometimes to get a coach. So the reason why I have this picture up is that The most important part of negotiating, and I can't stress this enough, is listening. You really have to pick up on the clues of the person you're negotiating with. You know, are they really paying attention to you as well? Are they really listening to what you have to say? You know, if they're not having good eye contact or leaning in and listening to you, kind of nodding their head in agreement, it's the same on both sides, I mean, you doing the same thing, you really need to pick up on those clues. Because again, in the end, you want it to be a win-win situation. So you have to really pick up on, like you could tell, like if someone's like got their arms crossed or they're really not engaged, you know, they may not be really listening to what you have to offer. Remember that you want to understand what their wants and needs are. You may not agree with them, but you need to understand them. Remember, we only have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So what else do they care about maybe versus the cost? Maybe it's not totally about the cost. Maybe it is about the cost and they have some fear and anxiety, like, oh, if I spend this money on this service, you know, what's the value? What am I going to get out of it? You know, the famous line when I'm doing career coaching is, if I talk to a potential client, they say, oh, I need to talk to my spouse, I pretty much can kiss that one goodbye. I know that they're not going to go ahead with it. I wish they were honest and would just say that. But, you know, there's certain words and phrases people use. But really be an active listener. And a lot of us are not. We have our minds, we're already thinking about how we're going to respond, or we're thinking about something else, or we're annoyed and we shut down, or we kind of get into analysis paralysis. So if you're not a good listener and you want to be a good negotiator, you've got to work on that. So, needless to say, negotiations can be difficult conversations. And with that, again, you need to kind of figure out how you handle difficult conversations and what the risk factor is. So, you know, if you're arguing with, say, your significant other, or if you have children or a family member, you know, that's a different type of conversation than maybe having with, well, it is a different conversation than having it with a customer or a client. So maybe you've reached an impasse. You know, they're not willing to budge. Maybe you're not willing to budge at that point. So you need to figure out, do you walk away? Do you say, you know what, let's table this and maybe we can talk about it later? Sometimes just having, you know, hitting that pause button can be invaluable. Maybe someone will come back and say, you know, I've given this some thought, and you know, I guess I didn't really realize how much you're offering, and in terms of the services you're providing, you know, or I've talked to, you know, a colleague of mine, the one who recommended you, and you know, I realized that maybe I was being difficult, or I just didn't realize, you know, how you're going to help me, and so I really do want to come back to the negotiations table. You know, demanding or ultimatums, if someone is doing that to you, you really need to try to neutralize the situation, because usually when they are demanding or being ultimative, they want to control the conversation, they want to control the negotiations, and ultimately they want to control you. So again, you really kind of need to neutralize the situation. You know, you need to, again, believe in your position, because when they start to throw ultimatums at you, your confidence may go down. You may start thinking, well, maybe they're right, or maybe, you know, they're so demanding, you know, I'm afraid if I don't take this, there's going to be repercussions. So really think about that as well. Needless to say, you want to save face. I don't think we need to talk about that really. I think that's a given. Again, you know, what's the solution? You know, can we brainstorm different alternatives? Can we come up with maybe something that will work for both of us? The next piece is perception, and this kind of goes back to the listening piece. When I'm actually a Bryan alum myself, one of the things I learned in my communications class is a famous line. There's no such thing as reality. Reality is what you perceive. Thus, your perception of life is your reality. So the point is that when you're in a negotiation, you might be on 2 different levels of perception. They may think of it this way or perceive it this way, and you perceive it differently. So asking how and what questions, and draw the person out and really understand where they're coming from, what's their needs, what's their timeline, you know, what they hope to get out of it, what do they hope to get out of it longer term. That's important, because you want to make sure that their perception of what you're offering is the same as what you are offering. The next piece is emotional intelligence. Needless to say, there's a lot of people out there that have very low emotional intelligence. They don't know how to manage their emotions. They don't know how to understand the emotions of others. So again, as you're trying to, work with this person, trying to understand, where they're coming from, you may have someone who has low emotional intelligence, and you're going to have to work through it. Maybe there is a lot of emotions attached to what they're buying, especially if it's a product. Maybe it is even a service as well. Again, the fear factor could come into that. People with low emotional intelligence tend to be very sensitive, and they also can be very fearful. So trying to identify that and then work through it. The other thing with difficult conversations is maybe acknowledging that either you don't understand where they're coming from or you don't understand what they're saying. And let's reframe the conversation. Let's use different terminology. Let's get on the same page. So taking, maybe again, hitting that pause button and acknowledging that you really don't understand where they're coming from and you'd like to understand their opinion. You also may want to ask them for permission for them to hear your opinion. And that's a great question. Would you like to hear my opinion on this subject? And they may say no, but at least you've kind of given them, you've kind of empowered them a bit. And especially if they get into a demanding or ultimatum type of situation, they like that power. And I'm not saying to give it to them the whole time, but definitely, acknowledging and reframing might be the route to go. The last piece is managing your wins and your losses. It actually has been proven, so research shows that people who are willing to listen to good news can listen to it in stages rather than all at once. However, they prefer to bear bad news in all one fell swoop. So if you have good news for a customer and you can give it to them kind of in piecemeal, but if for some reason, it's just not going to work, or let's say you were starting a project and it's not happening. So as an example, Avi mentioned, I am also an executive recruiter. I might have to go back to a client and say, I can't find any candidates for you. It's better to say it that way than kind of giving it to them in drips and drabs. So that's the thing about wins and losses. The last thing too is you need to hold your ground. Sometimes that's very hard to do, but it's important to make sure that you hold your ground. You have to go back to the word value. So if you have a tough time remembering that, I strongly suggest you put it like eye level, taped to the wall or whatever, and keep reminding yourself that you bring value to the table, and that's why you're even having this conversation with this person. So the next thing is that there's other things to consider. You're going to make mistakes when you negotiate. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I have certainly made mistakes when I've been negotiating. One of them has been that I haven't shot high. I actually had an opportunity to work with a corporate client. It was a new industry that I hadn't worked in before. I wasn't really sure, what to charge. So I went to 5 different people, kind of quasi colleagues of mine, and I asked them. And then I added more money to it because I didn't think any of their numbers were high enough. So I added some more money to it. I got the assignment, but then I should have talked to this last person. And if I had, I could have probably gotten not double, but close to double what I charged. I mean, I still was happy with what I got, but when I realized I could have gotten a lot more. So now what I do is I shoot high, and then considering I do it on the phone, I kind of hold my breath and hear what they have to say. The other thing is that you need to see patterns in your negotiations. Over time, just like when we deal with conflict, we kind of have certain patterns. Do we tend to lean towards avoiding, or do we tend to lean more towards compromising, or do we kind of walk through a negotiation a certain way? So really trying to identify the patterns in your negotiations. Even if you're doing negotiations, let's say over the phone, maybe having that business coach or colleague or co-partner, listening in on the call to hear how you're doing it, they may pick up on some patterns in your negotiations. The other piece is you need to separate the people from the problem. And this is where emotions versus fact come into play. This is facts, okay? When you're negotiating facts. This is the amount of the product or service, or this is the salary I want. This is what they want. It's fact. Where negotiations get tense, and if you've ever watched any kind of movie that has negotiations in it, emotions come into play. So you really have to separate the facts from the emotions and separate the people from the problem. And if you can really keep that objective opinion, keep your emotions in check as well, you should do well with this. The thing is that we fear loss, and especially with what's going on with the pandemic right now. Once things are back up to speed, some of you may need to take on pretty much every client or customer that comes through your door, and that's okay. But again, when the economy tanked in 2000, I actually started my company when the economy was bad in 1991. But when 2008 hit, and we're all scrambling for business, and believe me, the executive search business at that time was not the time to be in that business. I took on some clients that I shouldn't have, but I was so fearful of losing money that it really kind of clouded my vision of things. In hindsight, some of those clients were so annoying, and in the end, when I really did my per hour kind of analysis, it wasn't worth it. So really, you got to manage your own fears. The last piece is, or not the last piece, but second to last is company issues views can impede your negotiations. So what I mean by that is that, I do work for corporate clients. They may say, well, our budget is only this. Really? That's really what your budget is? I have a funny feeling if you're a Fortune 500 company, I think your budget could be bigger. So again, that could be well, I really wanted to, my fee is $1,000 for X. And they say, well, our budget's only 700. That's the company policy. Well, if I added 15 minutes, could I get the $1,000? So that would be a way to negotiate it. But a lot of times companies try to hide behind, this is our policy. And again, I can guarantee you in most cases you can negotiate it up. And then the other piece to this is, what is success? Is it selling that product? Is it building a relationship with a client? Is it having them refer? Is it being paid on time? Is it something else? Is it a learning experience? Maybe you take less money, for a service, but you're learning something. Like for me, working in a different industry. So you have to identify what is success. Another piece to this is, again, which I mentioned before, is you've got to be willing to walk away. You've got to figure out what your BATNA is, and you have to be willing to walk away. The other piece too is you've got to go with your gut. If it's not, and your gut tells you it's not going to work out, I can almost guarantee it's not going to. So as much as you need that money, or you need to build that relationship, but your gut telling you that this is going to be awful, I strongly suggest you walk away. Another piece too is silence. Use it to your advantage. The problem in negotiations is when you start to get nervous, you talk. Instead, be quiet and let the other person process what you're saying. If you're an extrovert and you're negotiating with an introvert, you need to shut up, because an introvert needs to process what you're saying, and it may take some time. But in general, we're uncomfortable with silence, but it can really work to our advantage. So if you're the type that talks, really learn to pause, maybe say, do you need a minute to think about this, or do you want to get back to me? Let them have that opportunity. And then the other thing is that after you, go through the negotiations, even if it's good or bad, I really strongly suggest you reflect on it. Not only get feedback maybe from the client in the future, but the other thing is to think about, what went right, what went wrong, maybe play out the scenario with someone else and figure out in the future, what can I do better? And, what went really, really well, and I need to consider doing it again the same way. So my father was a banker on Wall Street. Unfortunately, he passed away a long time ago. But two things my father always taught me, and I've always bring them up in my workshops, is the first is talk is cheap. And what my father meant by that is that you can always ask. The worst you're going to hear is no. But we're so fearful of hearing the word no that we don't ask. And, asking for a referral after a project or after you, have sold them a product, it's great, but we don't circle back. We're afraid to hear what they have to say. But my father has always said, you can always ask. If you're really nervous about it, do it over the phone. Then you don't even have to look at their facial expressions, but always ask. The other thing he taught me is you can always negotiate down, but you can't negotiate up. So again, shoot high, And then from there, you can always negotiate down. You can work through it, compromise, whatever it may be. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm sure we've gone through this pretty quickly. If you have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. So there's all my contact information. I'm sure Avi will also share it again. But I'm more than happy to help you with any negotiations you have, or if you have questions on it, please don't hesitate to contact me.